just to give you a bit of a background about who I am, some of my friends joke and call me Google Granger. If you turn in customs or trade facilitation, chances are that the academic titles that sort of come up, some of them would relate to my work. I've done quite a bit for the World Bank, the European Parliament. Gradually, there's some work that I'm also doing in the UK, most recently about product safety. Brexit is sort of becoming on the agenda. Not too long ago, I had a tenured position at the University of Nottingham, where I still live, but I'm very pleased to also be working at TU Delft at the tail end of a very interesting, very nice EU research project. Of course, if we're affiliated to a British university, that might be a bit more difficult to carry on with, but let's see with that. My hometown is Nottingham, and certainly those of you who did not put their hand up with saying they have no knowledge of customs should know Nottingham really well, because it's the home of the patron of all customs officers. He's very famous for taking away from the rich and giving back to the poor. So I think you can all associate yourself very well with Robin Hood. I wouldn't want to rob too much time, but I would like to sort of make reference to that. But yes, I would invite you, have a look at what I've produced. But what I'd like to comment now is a sort of a Brexit perspective as the person who has a British passport, which, if you look at my own family history, is quite difficult. I was brought up in Germany. I've lived in many places. This can be quite a tough subject to engage with. So just bear in mind, Britain at the moment is quite a split country. I know of lots of friends who do not speak to their parents anymore. I live in a university town where one half of the town was very much pro-Remain, and the other half of the town was all over the place. I have friends who went on buses and have been abused for speaking another language. But then when I think about my son's school, it's a primary school, 1,500 kids, and they speak over 50 languages there, so they're celebrating diversity, they're living it. So in that context, Brexit sometimes can be something, for anyone, quite difficult to understand. So I'll just give that as a disclaimer, but I'll try and stick to facts. I don't know if this works, but does YouTube work? No. You all know Homer Simpson? This might make things a little like, no. Okay, it's not going to work. But it has often been compared, Brexit, to the 5 stages of grief. You know, when you had really, really bad news, you start off with denial. No. Then you get a bit angry. Gosh, can these people really be true? It goes on to fear. What's going to happen? And I know, certainly, I checked whether I've got an Irish grandfather. I don't. Bargaining, can we negotiate? And then last but not least, acceptance. And that can be a tricky one. I mean, we've all been urged to consider that it's going to happen. But I just want to provide a political backdrop to where politics currently are in the United Kingdom. It's a messy map. And if you follow British media, you will be living and breathing this. But just the narrative, if you read the daily newspapers in the United Kingdom, it's a very complicated one. It starts off over here with the government, so Theresa May and the three Brexiteers, so that's Liam Fox, David Davis and Boris Johnson. One has the remit for the Ministry of Trade, the other one the remit for negotiating exit out of the European Union, and the third one is our foreign minister. Then you have those that are a bit on the fence, but responsible for all the money, making sure that the funds to fund Brexit would be there. And that's our Chancellor, Osborne, who is criticised by much of his own party as being somebody who's pro-European and a Remainer. Then you also have the political tribes within the governing Conservative Party. So you have, we refer to them as backbenchers. Those are not part of the government, but they're in the government's party, and they can sort of choose who gets selected and who gets what posts and things like that. So after the transition agreement, if you watch this morning's BBC, for example, it was Jacob Rees-Mogg, sort of very prominent Brexiteer, for whom the transition agreement can't be fast enough. but he's swallowing his pride at the moment. At the other end, you've got backbenchers like Anne Sabri, who are out there to remind how good the European Union is, and they really have difficulty sort of squaring the position of the government with their own party allegiances. So probably there's about 10 people within the leading party willing to threaten to walk away. At the same time, it is a minority government. So the leading party, the Conservatives at the moment, are only in power by the grace of the DUP, which is one of the parties in Northern Ireland. Just to make matters worse, or more complicated, depending how you want to look at it, Northern Ireland at the moment has a hung parliament. So their parliament is hung to the point that they can't reach agreement. At the moment, it is about DUP opposition to teaching the Irish language in the Northern Ireland school curriculum. That's one of the key issues. The result of such a hung parliament could mean that very soon, if things don't get resolved quickly, powers for Northern Ireland would refer back to London, which could have all sorts of other political consequences and uncertainties. At the same time, the other devolved administration, the Scottish Parliament, are very much pro-European, so they always dig into London when they take a view that might be particularly damaging to the country. Then you also have the Labour Party, the opposition. Depending on what polls you read, it's suspected that if elections were to take place today, Labour might have a good chance of winning, considering that their agenda is a very, very hard left one, and they have been quite, at least at party leadership, quite silent about Brexit over the last year. This could be quite a shift change. And to add up onto all of that, if you look at the Parliament and how it is split up, the MPs themselves, most of them were in support of remaining in the European Union. So the referendum has created a real political conundrum, and it is a very volatile situation, and much of the media focuses on the challenges by the backbenchers against the government at the moment. So you'll hear lots of noises, and it's confusing. So a week might be long in politics, a day might be long in politics. I'm curious what's going to happen tomorrow in politics. So that's the backdrop. But at least the government position is Brexit, it's going to happen. And the advice towards the business community is in whatever form Brexit is going to take place, we know it's going to be a disruption because there's a lot of political noise, and we would have to work towards that. Oops. There we are. If you wanted to look at my early thoughts after Brexit, when I looked at David Davis, our Brexit negotiator, he wrote a 1.5-page manifesto on Brexit. And within that 1.5 pages was one sentence about customs issues. He said, there will be customs issues of a technical nature, and these can be resolved, full stop. And I thought, no, I can't leave it at that. And working at University of Nottingham, I sat down for a day and I wrote an 800-word article. So if you were to Google Andrew Granger and Brexit, you will come up to an article in the conversation. It's also been reprinted in many other places. It's an open license. But the key points there is that depending how you count and which sources you refer to, there are about 5,000 to 8,000 customs officers currently in the United Kingdom. If you ask the business community, who knows in UK customs how to do origin rules, they respond by giving you the names of those individuals. So it's probably less than 1 or 2 handfuls of individuals who are expert on customs and valuation type issues. For a long time, there's been no training, no re-recruitment of customs officers in the UK. So it's a very poor department, or very efficient department, depending how you want to look at it. There's quite a lot of uncertainty about what rules would apply, although with the transition agreement, maybe a bit more certainty will come into place. Just bearing in mind, if you were to implement new systems, these don't take months, these take years. I might even hazard a guess, might even take a decade to implement. You have to procure them, you have to do the specification for those systems, you have to test those systems. There has to be a transition period, you have to look at the legacy systems, you have to work out how to switch off those legacy systems. You have to pay for it. These are all things that need to be sorted out. Some of those have political dimensions. But politicians do policy. This is technical stuff, so how to bring those two things together can be quite difficult. There would be, bearing in mind, UK very much talks about its own borders, almost forgetting that there will be also costs when it wants to trade with the continent. So we're not talking about one border, we're talking about two borders. So the Institute for Government, for example, refers to Brexit not as a cliff edge, but as a canyon. So there's two cliffs. And then, of course, we have things that we heard out through the morning when you have delays, this impacts on logistics operations, you have to put contingency measures in place, you might have to hold additional inventory stock, buffer stock, those sort of things. I just felt, just after Brexit, I had to get this off my soul. My wife was getting very upset with me for being so depressed for 2 weeks. This was me trying to become constructive again. But if you think about what a customs manager, somebody in an organization who deals with customs issues actually does, I did this in a paper a few years back. I picked up the phone and I did what I think every good academic should do if they have an interest in a profession. They should ask people, what is it you're doing? So I did that. I interviewed quite a few senior customs managers. So what is it you do all day? And 3 themes emerged. For you, this might be quite obvious. But one theme relates to logistics. It's about making sure there's no bottlenecks in your operations, making sure goods go through the over the borders without disruption, and you support that. Then the customs manager might also be involved in supply chain management type issues. So working out where do you buy things, where are things more cost effective, how do you structure your procurement, how do you work with your suppliers, do you take advantage of preference rules or not? It's these sort of questions that customs professionals, especially multinational organizations, might be involved in, and they might do lots of modeling and trying to work out how customs and trade-related issues would impact on their overall supply chain costs. But what all managers said, some said we work in supply chains, others said we work in logistics, what they all said is we work in compliance. They're very mindful that if they get things wrong, their company would be subject to fines. In many jurisdictions, they individually might be subject to criminal charges. Customs law in many places is subject to criminal law. So you could go to prison in an extreme case if you get it wrong. So it's these sort of 3 themes that customs managers are dealing with in the private sector, especially in the United Kingdom. And they all do it differently. But if you look at sort of the Brexit world, this relates to an early study, ironically, I did for the European Commission. It was when the European Commission was opening up conversations with Mercosur about a trade deal. And they said, well, look, if we wanted to talk about red tape and trade facilitation, what should we talk about? And I asked her, what's the main commodity South America would want to trade with the European Union? And they said, well, maybe it's beef and poultry. So I thought, okay, I'll pick up the phone and I'll speak to all the meat importers and exporters I can find. I spoke to the embassy, quite a few other organizations, and tried to map out the procedures. And I don't want to give away too much from the next workshop, but when it comes to compliance, at the top of this cause and effect diagram is the compliance steps required in the country of export, and at the lower side of the slide, you're looking at the requirements here in the European Union, including the UK at the moment. So you would have to register your business. This could be getting an IORI number. It could be getting a VAT number, becoming an established premise so you can claim back VAT and things like that. In the country of export, you would need a health certificate. You have to get a veterinarian out. A veterinarian is qualified under EU rules to issue a veterinary health certificate. You have to get a certificate of origin so you can apply for an EU import quota. And once you start mapping all these things together, you find that customs, the customs declaration, what everyone in the media talks about, might be the smallest step of the lot. So again, you will find this slide quite a lot on the internet, but yes, if you bring in phytosanitary and all the other things about wood packaging, it becomes a complex slide. And worse, you sometimes get catch-22 situations where you need one document from the country of export in order to get the other document from the country of import, and vice versa. And then you sort of get lock-ins that make things really difficult, catch-22s. If you were to count just the steps necessary to import that meat into the United Kingdom, we're looking at about 26 procedural steps. They relate to applying for your import quota from the Rural Payment Agency. They relate to procedures specific to the shipping line to arrange for the shipment. They relate to procedures between a shipping line and a port authority to pay for handling during, for example, physical inspection. They relate to procedures with the Port Health Authority, which in the United Kingdom is part of the local authorities. So these are veterinary checks. They relate to procedures with customs, and they relate to procedures with the port. And depending how you count them, the responsibilities will differ depending on who is responsible for them. So whether you're doing it on a FOB, free on board type contract, or a CIF contract, it will differ who bears the cost. So when it comes to Brexit and we want to know how much will it cost, as a practitioner, the first question is, what Incoterms are we talking about? And if you mention that to a policymaker or a politician, they'll go, oh my God, what's this about? So if you were to think about Brexit, there are two positions. One is about spinning lots of plates. It's almost like in a circus. So if you were in a business, have to think about the impact. It's keeping everything going. Lots of people at the moment, especially bearing in mind the political noise in the United Kingdom, the uncertainty, it might be that of an ostrich sticking their head in the sand. So it's somewhere between circus clown and ostrich is sort of what I see the spectrum that businesses can take in order to respond and be prepared for Brexit. But if you wanted to consider it, what pun there, take back control might be, at the very least, it's about building a border. It means it's about goods, which we might be familiar in the customs world, but it's also about the vehicles that move those goods, and it's also about the people that move those vehicles. And one of the tricky things, certainly in the news from the last few days, is about whether the cabotage rights, the possibility of truck drivers would be able to drive into the United Kingdom or not. Whether airlines, British Airlines, can carry on flying to the European Union, or anywhere else in the world for that matter. These are real tricky issues. So it's not just about customs, it's also about lots of non-customs procedures, and it's not just about goods, it's also about the vehicles that move those goods, and it's about the people moving those goods. Bearing in mind, UK has a shortage of truck drivers, for example, so I think it's about 1/3 of all truck drivers come from Eastern Europe. So likewise in the warehousing sector, again, Eastern Europe provides a lot of the labor that the United Kingdom needs. When it comes to logistics operations, so yes, transport regulations, so it's not just customs. So operating license, freedoms of the skies, labor, drivers, warehousing staff, these are all real issues that companies have to grapple with now. If you were to listen to the likes of David Davis and the like, there's a lot of hope put into technology. So maybe robots can replace a lot of the work that's recreated. And fair enough, logistics sector is one of those sectors next to education where lots of people are going to be replaced by robots. You can have apps doing wonderful things. You can have fully automated warehouses, but these things don't happen overnight. So this is not an immediate solution to labor shortages. If you were to look at it in the context of the supply chain, you're looking at things like, where does your national content come from? Do you want to comply with the with preferential rules with Korea? If we could get a similar arrangement as the European Union has with Korea, would we be able to produce anything that has 50% national content? I suspect the United Kingdom would not be able to do that. Access to preferential duty rates, certainly for many retailers, this is a really big issue, a big question. Where shall we place our orders for our textiles? Will there be still a GSP regime in place? These are really big questions. So there will be an impact, certainly on the cost of supply, and in addition to that, there will be an impact on the administrative costs, which in turn will have an impact on compliance costs, which will feed into the supply chain in some way or other. If you were to look at it in the context of compliance, so the other part that customs professionals do, making sure that companies are compliant. Yes, it's the legal framework, which has been maybe ripped up and rewritten, we don't quite know yet. It's about the supporting electronic systems. So these are not just government systems, these are also the private systems. Bear in mind, the UK Most compliance systems that exist in the UK, for example, it's port community systems. These are private sector initiatives. The UK government is free riding on these. So the private sector built these systems, and then they give, for example, customs-free access to these systems. So if the requirements and specifications change, the private sector needs incentives to make changes to them. There has to be consultation. These things take time. I doubt the transition period is enough for the UK in order to sort out these problems, just from an IT perspective alone. When it comes to supporting services by intermediaries, most companies don't do customs compliance themselves, they outsource. But will the third-party logistics service providers, will the freight forwarders have the capacity to look after the sudden influx of new businesses with new compliance requirements? This is a really big question. Chances are no. Some freight forwarders are joking to me. Well, you know, there's one country where there's a lot of qualified customs professionals and they're not being utilized. They have 6 universities that are teaching customs. UK, by the way, doesn't have a single university teaching customs-related issues. The Philippines, I think there's 6 colleges that teach customs. So, you know, if I get my wallet out, maybe I'll think about setting up a call center, you know, tariff classification, that sort of stuff.
Taking back and forth.
Anyone want to join with me? But yes, staff resourcing is a real issue. You have to get these professionals that don't grow on trees. And certainly in the United Kingdom, the policy was, and I used to work for CITBRA, the UK Trade Facilitation Agency, if you can make rules and procedures as simple as possible so that you can comply with them, you don't need to be an expert with them. Unfortunately, at the moment, those rules and procedures are still tricky and involved. So you do need experts, and we don't have them at the moment. Yeah, and already mentioned education and training, the other element, which in the UK is haphazard, I would say. It's certainly not a recognized profession, such as in other countries which have qualified freight forwarders or qualified customs brokers and the like within their realms. When it comes to mitigating measures, we had quite a bit of that in presentations earlier this morning. But if you were to reflect on work I did, for example, for the European Parliament, yes, there are the trade facilitation principles, so simplification, harmonization, modernization, standardization, so all good practices to make trade and customs procedures easier to comply with using IT systems, bringing them up to date with best practices, learning from other countries how to do things really well, and trying to implement it at home. When it comes to improving the borders, we're talking about border management. So again, quite often, I've noticed it in conversations this morning as well, we treat border agencies as fragmented institutions. So it's understanding how we can have, I think the word was one government earlier this morning, how we can work on a one government level. But that's not just between, let's say, customs and phytosanitary and veterinary. It's also within the government departments, between the head office and the ports. How do you ensure consistency? You're talking about guidance instruments, you're talking very good training, these sort of issues. And then you're also looking at about cooperation with the private sector. The vehicle in EU customs law is that of the AEO, but there are also other types of authorizations. For example, if you wanted to run a port, certainly in the UK customs will make specifications of what types of officers the customs officers would like to have it in if they want to provide services to that port and how the inspection facilities should look like. And then the port operator has to provide this. If you look across the border, then you're looking at cooperation agreements. So it's not just free trade agreements with a trade facilitation chapter. You're also looking at customs cooperation agreements. You're looking at exchanges. You're looking at helping each other out, maybe mutual recognition agreements. It's all these sort of things that would be in the standard toolbox of anyone who wants to reduce friction. I mean, eliminating friction is about getting rid of borders. That's the rationale of the European Union. But if you want to reduce the impact of borders, then this would be the arsenal to use in order to mitigate that impact. So as a problem, yes, it's customs, but there's quite a few others. So I would argue it's definitely a political issue. Otherwise, we wouldn't be there where we are now. It's a legal issue. It's about writing the rules and regulations in order to govern the markets that you want to have, and when, as a regulator, you want to step in. It's an administrative issue. How do you enforce those regulations? It is an economic issue. Those regulations have a cost. How you interpret them, how you apply them will impact your supply chains, your cost of supply, your access to world markets. your business opportunities. It's an operational issue, so it's how do you administer it, how does that impact relating to your compliance operations, would it delay goods at the borders, those sort of things. And it's a technological issue. So some might see that technology could be a panacea in the future, but as a subject, we were combining all these 6 components together. And it's a juggling act, isn't it? So when it comes to business, I've done this in a different research stream I was involved. I had a really big project in the UK about the impact of floods on UK ports. Our ports are incredibly specialized. So if one port gets damaged, its nearest competitor is only half its size in terms of capacity. So Dover, for example, looks at about 40% of its ro-ro traffic. Its nearest competitor is Grimsby, which looks at about 8% of ro-ro traffic. So if something happened at one major port, we asked a question, would the other ports be able to step in? Our conclusion was no. And of course, Brexit is a different class of catastrophe. If we had to delay goods at places like Dover on ro-ro traffic, one of my researchers worked out how long that queue would be and then got very worried when the media picked up on those figures. But one projection is a traffic jam from Dover to London. But what you would have to do as a business, I mean, this is not just going to affect you, it's going to affect your competitors as well. So in business continuity planning, you talk about maximum tolerable period of disruption. How much pain can you bear before it hurts? So if everyone bears the same pain, it might be okay, it's the consumer who pays for it. But there might be market failures, regulators might have to step in. These are conversations that have yet not taken place. So it's trying to work out the pain thresholds for each and every sector involved. And there will be a threat, like for example a flood, a tidal surge, or Brexit. It has an impact on your organization. There's time to respond, and you can recover back to a level that you will feel happy about. It might be as it was before, it might be better as it before, it might be less than as before, but these are conversations organizations and stakeholders need to have. So I'll leave it at that, but I can't leave the stage without giving a quick pitch. So if you go to Google Scholar, you'll find most of my work from which I've drawn this presentation via hyperlinks freely accessible.
Thank you very much, Andy.
And in time.